You're tuned into RX Radio. Movement prescribed. Brought to you by Prescript.com. A personalized approach to keeping you healthy and making your best even better. Your hosts, Dr. Jordan Shallow and Dr. Jordan Jinta.
What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of RX Radio. Out of the gate, huge thank you to everyone who signed up. For those of you who don't know, Prescript Level 1 August semester is up for sale by popular demand and very much indicated by the response. Very excited for the group of coaches we have coming in. I mean, the caliber and the quality, I think, you know, for too long, I think that's kind of what led me to design the curriculum. Is like people didn't trust fitness professionals with this kind of information, but I think we're seeing a turn of the tide that, you know, as people go out and start to upskill, that there's a need for this higher level of thinking when it comes to training. You know, it's a sophisticated approach that appears simple, and this course is just going to help you look under the hood and make better informed, sort of data-driven decisions when it comes to rehabilitation, sports performance, body composition. I mean, we have everything from physical therapists, medical doctors, osteopaths, chiropractors, professional athletes, down to, you know, people who just want to understand, software engineers, people who just want to understand their body better. So the PSL 1 course is up for sale now. If you go to www.pre-script.com, you'll see the PSL 1 tab there at the top. Seats are going quick, the quickest they've gone so far. So we might have to limit the pre-sale and then hold off until a little bit closer to the date. But for this week, it's going to be up for sale, and I'll keep you guys updated as we go from week to week. So it's going to be a 16-week curriculum. I teach every module. I teach 4 times a week across different time zones. I think with the signups right now, we have coaches set to span over 20 countries, which is incredible. I really can't believe the response to this, and just getting to watch you guys. I mean, I try and follow everyone that gets signed up for the course. When they post something from their lecture, I'll make sure that I always try and follow them just to kind of see what they're up to and see how they synthesize information and challenge paradigms. And it's really been a phenomenal a year of teaching this course. And I think with every coach that comes in, every athlete that comes in, every clinician that comes in, the value behind the course is really just in the skill set of the people that take it. So hats off to everyone, future and past, who's taken the course or plan on taking the course. Huge shout out, guys. You know, so we got 16 weeks starting first week of August. This will take us right through November. It's 4 months. It's, to my knowledge, the longest course that's currently offered in continuing education when it comes specifically to applied biomechanics and anatomy. It's a different lens in which to look through sports performance. We take clinical theory, practical application, and critical thinking, which I think is the biggest takeaway at the end of the day. But all the bill paying aside, guys, this episode is my favorite conversation I think I've had, and I don't want to discredit anyone that I've had on the podcast, guys. If you haven't listened to even last week, we had Nick Gloff on. And just an incredible dude, doing incredible things. Mind, body, the guy's a monster. But this week, for me, like, this is a pioneer. Like, this is a dude, and pioneer has like a weird sort of historical connotation. Like, he's not still an active contributing member to this. Derek Woodske is the single most interesting human being I've ever met. He's the fucking Dos Equis dude of lifting weights. He has taken a barbell further than any human being ever on the planet, and I do mean further. He has the, and look, this is when you know, like, it's just a good conversation, and that's all this is. Like, usually with podcasts, there's a little bit of preamble, especially when they're remote. We kind of sit down, like, yeah, you know, so like, how are things? How's life and all this. With Derek, with this podcast, it's gonna start where we started. He answered the Zoom call, and there was I had every plan. Like I had planned to sit there and go like, hey, what's up, man? Like, all right, we're going to dive into this. I'll do a little intro and all that. No, this is literally this is how the conversation went from the second he answered the phone on the Zoom call. We're going to actually put we're going to put the video of the call up on YouTube as well. And it just, he's so well traveled and experienced, and we barely even talk about training. He's going to come back on because his outlook on training, I think, to me, being an ex-Poliquin coach, being an elite level athlete, having a therapy background, he's it. Like if a high school guidance counselor asked me what I want to be when I grow up, I would say Derek Woodske. He's from Western Canada, good old Canadian boy. We cross paths in such an interesting way in Mammoth, California. And it's just, we get a little bit of like how we met in there as well. It is the coolest thing. And I tell you what, exercise programming, guys, we don't get into it too much. We talk about UFOs and, the crown princess of Saudi Arabia, all the way to, the Zach Brown band and touring with rock stars as a strength coach and being on albums as a strength coach. And, we talk about the current landscape around civil rights and racism and some of the historical milestones in civil rights that he was around for in the early days. And it's such a cool conversation, the coolest guy I think you'd ever want to come across. And we don't get into exercise programming much, which is for me, like with Derek, that's really what caught my attention with him, is his thought processes around training. So we'll get him back on for a volume 2. But if you're interested in what he gets up to when it comes to training, he does do, and with a friend of the show, Matt Vincent, the Daily Destroyer is a new programming offering that he has. I highly recommend checking it out. Derek is one of the sharpest strength coaches I've ever come across, and just one of like the sharpest dudes, like just about everything, like so fucking interesting. I'm smiling ear to ear as I say this. I cannot overstate how interesting a dude, like he's a fucking gem. So super grateful he took the time. This is our longest podcast we've ever had. This thing runs 2 hours, and me and Derek chatted for another probably 45 minutes after this. So we'll get it back on training. Check out Daily Destroyer. Check out Derek Woodske. Enjoy this podcast. Share with your friends. If there was one that kind of encapsulated what I think this podcast is all about outside of the training stuff, it's this one. Like, it just runs history, political science, international diplomacy, rock and roll, conspiracy theories. Like, this guy could just go. So I'm without further ado, guys, Prescript Level 1 course open for registration now. If you want to hop on the PSL1 coaching certification course, 16 weeks, me teaching online starting August. Get on the pre-sale quick. We're going to keep this updated week to week, as we might have to limit the number of students as the signups were so kind of fast and furious out of the gate. Check out Derek Woodske. Check out Daily Destroyer. We'll have all the info in the show notes. So guys, I hope you do enjoy the episode. If you like the episode, share it up on Instagram, let your friends know and all that. This is going to be one of my favorites. And Derek, again, thank you so much for coming on, man. Hope you guys enjoy. We'll see you next week.
Oh,
there it is.
Hey, what's up, brother?
What's going on? Yeah, good.
How are things?
Oh man, it's outside of the obvious, the small town of Mammoth almost feels like there's people back here again.
I felt like you've just been living on set of Children of the Corn.
I'll tell you what, man, it's this town in particular, and I didn't realize how slow California is to reopen until I realized that the gyms in British Columbia have been open for 3 weeks. Right?
Yeah,
that's a problem. Yeah.
Especially where you're at. Like, you got to that one state park gate and it was just like closed because of COVID. Like, what? What are you, like, worried about the bears? Like, what are you talking about?
I just was speaking to a guy recently that as a photographer works here in town, and he takes a lot of nighttime photography out in Death Valley, which is only like 70 miles from here. And it's, Death Valley, obviously there's nothing going on this time of the year. It's too hot. And he was out there by himself, and someone turned him around in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, it was. Yeah, to me, when you're getting turned around in Death Valley, it's probably because there's some secret shit going on that you're not supposed to know about.
Yeah, it's like Area 52 shit going on.
It's right over the mountains.
That's terrifying, man. I'm so lucky I got trapped here. Like, it's business as usual. Like,
right?
Yeah, it's crazy. Like, we're staying in, so we're in eastern suburbs of Sydney, like Bondi Beach, which was like the hardest hit in the country. It's just a tourist hotspot, right? But like I think they did such a good job of like accurately reporting real fatal cases, and the whole country was like under 100.
Well,
like,
and you probably already read this, but now all of a sudden there's information coming out that ventilating a COVID case can kill you.
What?
Yeah. So like Michael Ho, the actor, I think it was, the guy that got really sick that was on Rogan.
Yeah.
His doctor didn't ventilate him. His doctor prevented the ventilation from occurring because he said if they had ventilated him, it would have killed him. He said what they're finding, it's causing the lungs to stop working, like some weird stuff. So there's some like the amount of misinformation that people are dealing with over here is catastrophic, especially when a hospital gets $39,000 to ventilate a COVID patient from the government. Right. So there's like, you can get into all the weirdness, but those are real numbers. It's positive COVID is like $4,000. Next level COVID is $9,000. Innovation is $39,000. So with all these hospitals shutting down financially, private sector, there's probably some innovations going on that probably weren't necessary.
I can't wait for the Netflix special, man. That's what I'm looking forward to.
It's going to be ugly.
Yeah. Because I saw Buddy, Shane Smith, the guy from Vice, Canadian dude. Mm-hmm. He did one he somehow found Snowden, and they did a Vice piece with Snowden about COVID. And it's like he's put up in, somewhere in a dark room. He's in like he's in the Kremlin in a janitor's closet. Just like the last place looks back to find me. And he was just like, man, it's the scary part. Like, because I got into a debate with one of my in-laws. First met like this in-law, my girlfriend's. Who was it? It was Christian's parents. I was having so my a family member of my girlfriend's extended family. I was talking about like, look, you got to be really careful about like, the permanent easement you've just afforded your government to monitor and traffic your behavior. And she's like, well, I was like, I'm fucking going into the weeds on this. Like, I got a guy who our CTO worked for NASA and he used to work for DARPA. So like he runs our tech for our, right? Like he was working on Sleepless Soldiers and shit. When I first met this guy, he came in. So my office used to be right down the street from Ames Research Center. So Ames NASA Research Center in Mountain View, California. And this guy comes in and, like PhD works, he's head of lead advanced robotics at NASA. And after the visit, he pays me with a check. I'm like, the fuck am I supposed to do with this? What is this, like 1984? Who pays with checks?
Exactly.
And he's like, if you knew what I knew, you'd never use a credit card again. I was like, oh, Jesus.
100%. If for some reason the signal gets real suspect, we've been having issues with high winds up here in our 5G they have put in. We're a test site for 5G, right? How about that?
Right. So there's your COVID.
There's your COVID. Not to mention, I want to hear something so bizarre about this town. The stoplights on Main Street stopped working the day that the COVID shut down the town. And then the stoplights started working again the day that they went into, like, lifted it for fishing season. So like for almost 4 months, we had blinking reds in town. Like they did everything possible to create the illusion that people should not be here.
Why don't you just play like the Silent Hill, like the big alarm, man. The dust starts coming in.
It's exactly. So this is, I try not to get down too many rabbit holes, especially with with the weird stuff, because people don't know how to take it. But I was given videos last week, and I'm not a big UFO guy, but like I'm just, whatever, like I don't have much experience. And this dude, this photographer that goes out to Death Valley, he goes, hey man, check this out. I mean, like he's a server at the breakfast place that we haven't been to for 4 months, right? And I'm like, hey man, how you been? He's like, good. He goes, I've been going out into Alabama Hills, which is, near Death Valley. And when And he goes, I've been taking nighttime exposure photography. He goes, but I've been picking up some weird stuff. And I'm like, what kind of weird stuff? He's like, well, I don't know. Check it out. Dude, like perfect capture on his cell phone, silent discs the size of like half a football field, just cruising over. Like basically imagine the most sophisticated drone you've ever seen, completely silent, and they're just flying. And then he has videos of these drone looking things that shoot up out of the desert floor to like what he can't even estimate distance wise. He's catching them with telescopic lenses, and they're doing like perfect patterns with no concept of like G-force gravity. So they're probably unmanned. And I'm like, what do you think it is? He's like, I don't know. He goes, they don't make any sound. He goes, and they fly every single night. And I'm like, when did they start? And he's like, well, when COVID shut down all of California into Nevada, he goes, the activity went through the roof. He goes, it used to be once in a while you might see something. He goes, we see something every single night in Death Valley. Every single night they film it. And I mean, shockingly crisp. No, not nighttime either. And so, and I'm like, well, have you had any weird experiences? And he's like, he goes, yeah, man. I was driving through Death Valley to get to where I was going to set up. And out of nowhere, the military shows up from like behind these dunes, and they stopped him and they're like, hey, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm a photographer. And they're like, yeah, man, it's quarantine, right? You shouldn't be out here. And he's like looking around. He's like, yeah, but it's Death Valley. Everything's closed. This is probably the safest place I could be. And you could see that the guy was kind of stuck, right? And he's like, okay. He goes, all right, this whole area is closed off. You know, 25 miles north and south, you got to get out of here. And whatever you do, just don't fly your drones if you got them. And he's like, all right. And they just turned around and left. He never gave it much thought, right? This guy's from like the hills. He's not like a real techie guy. And that was like 3 weeks ago.
I love how like right at the peak of all of the COVID stuff, the government declassified all of that UFO info. Like it was like an additional rider on a local bill to like put smoking back into casinos or something. Like, hey, we're going to open up parks and give like we're sign this rider. And they just put like a little attachment to it. Like we're going to allow smoking in public places again. It was like, hey, the world's shutting down. Yeah. Hey, Tom DeLonge was totally right. Like he was on mushrooms playing for Blink 182, but he fucking called it. Was like, wait, can we revisit this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like last night, a guy at a local shop here in town, like a ski store, I had to run in there, and he's like, hey man, he goes, you see this thing on the news? Like it said that, you know, gatherings of such a number are not deemed a health risk if it is for the sake of protesting. And I'm like, no. And he's like, yeah, he said an article came out with the whatever national health said that large group protesting is not seen as a risk for the spread of COVID, but, and it's worth a Google because it's everywhere right now. However, gatherings to protest the stay-at-home order are not advised.
Just waiting for Trump to turn into the Manchurian Candidate.
Right? It didn't make any sense. He's like, ooh. And because it doesn't make any sense. Like, why would they write that? And then you realize in West Hollywood, there was 20,000 people yesterday in a gathering. I'll tell you what, it's like I was talking to Matt Vincent this morning on his podcast, and we both agree. If 2 weeks from now, we don't see a catastrophic spike in cases in the United States, then it's all been bullshit. Yeah. It's like, there's something, I don't know what it is, but what it is, clearly no one understands.
Yeah. And it has to be man-made. Like, have you seen, even now with like, just I don't want to say convenience about like around like the riots, but just the agent provocateur activity. Like, did you see on Queen Street in Toronto that there was a planned march, and then someone was like, look, there's inexplicable stacks of bricks lining Queen Street in Ontario.
In Ontario, right? It's like, come on. So the provocateurs is a great way to describe it. So they started to discover on the second night of the protests, as they became violent, that there was clearly, well, the pallets of bricks was the one example, but equipment that had been placed ahead of the marches. So it was like, and then the videos start coming out and people just calling it. Like, the most interesting part of the whole story is the Minneapolis Umbrella Man. It almost seems like something out of science fiction, right?
What is this? Well, I don't know what you're talking about.
Right. So this video shows up before everything got really aggressive in Minneapolis with the fires and the rioting. There was an AutoZone, and they catch him on video. This guy wearing all black, holding an umbrella like it's raining out. Okay. He has a gas mask on already with pink ventilators on the side, which they now believe that this is actually a cop in disguise. Like, there's a bunch of conspiracy theories because the eyes match up to this one officer. But he's walking with an umbrella next to AutoZone in the middle of the day, smashing out the windows with a wrench. And all they know is he's referred to as the Umbrella Man. Because when they approach him to stop him, he just casually walks away, gets to where he's going to get into his car, turns back and is aggressive at one of the people that was filming him. It creates this gap of time, and then he leaves the scene. It doesn't make any sense.
It's Hunger Games. I'm just waiting for the whistle. Like, I'm waiting for Katniss to just come save all of us. Like, just to pledge. Just like, please, someone, put an end to this. Dude, how close does Donald Trump look to that? Look like that main guy with the big flow.
Oh, with the pompadour hair, right?
Yeah, it's art imitating life or life imitating art. It's fucking terrifying.
Well, I mean, The Simpsons predicted everything, including the murder bees in an episode, right? So The Simpsons have an episode from way back talking about a pandemic that is going to kill everybody, right? Unless they stay indoors. And then someone in the cartoon is like, there's the cure. And they turn and kick over this box and a bunch of bees come out. And this is years ago.
But that's the weird part, man. Like, history repeats. Like, what 1968 was the Hong Kong virus, right? 1969, we put a man to the moon.
You're the only other person that actually talks about this. Woodstock occurred during an American pandemic, and no one gives a shit. 100,000 people died.
Yeah.
Hong Kong flu. No one talks about it.
Well, that's the thing, man. Like, that's with like, and I don't go too deep into the riots. Like, I barely am qualified to talk about the things that people claim me to be an expert in. Like, I tell people to stand on one leg and squat deadlift. Like, I'm not an orator of our time. So, but it's, if you look at the civil unrest around, the American Civil Rights Movement in the late 1960s, right. You look on the same day, Elon Musk sent guys into space. We had like the beginning of the riots, and it's like, how is this like? So to some, you can look at The Simpsons and other, mystic types. There was someone that wrote a book, I forget her name, that she predicted same thing, 2020 pandemic, like down to a T. But it's like, if you look in the continuum of history, it's just repeating itself, right? So it's like, is it premonitions, or are they just well read? Like, oh, like this is kind of an homage to the crazy end of the 1960s with the Hong Kong flu, Woodstock, 1969, Man on the Moon. Is this were they looking at that as a muse and inspiration for the way they write? And now all of a sudden it's come full circle. Like, I have clothes that are back in fashion again. Plaid. I own the finest collection of plaid. All of a sudden people are calling me a hipster. It's like, no, I was born in Newfoundland, and my dad gave me this shirt. Like, oh man, that's like a vintage Labatt's blue. Did you make that? Yeah. Oh, my dad got it in a 2-4 in the 99 playoffs. Like, what are you talking about? It's just, this is coming back into fashion. Like, pandemics they're like Hansel, man. They're so hot right now.
They're so hot. And the funny thing is this, like my old man, red plaid rolled up to the sleeve, jeans, work boots. That's what hipster. He wore to hipster, and that's what he wore to work. He was so ahead of his time, right? But he also looks like a beatnik in the 1960s. Like, he was, and it does repeat itself. And dude, how many times in our industry, look at CrossFit right now.
Pitchforks. Get your pitchforks, ladies and gentlemen.
Dude. So I said this to somebody today, and they'd probably like punch me in the face if they could, in terms of the society. But like, I was just reading through all this stuff when I found out what happened, and I'm just like, man, nothing tastes worse than poisoned Kool-Aid. Right?
It went bad. They left it out in the sun. They turned
It went bad. You know,
it's tough, man. Like a close friend of mine, Ryan Fisher, was like kind of the black sheep of CrossFit. Like, and you know, you can't tell people you're gonna kill them in the middle of a competition. I understand that. And he's just an intense dude. And I think there's some like no amount of backpedaling in the world can save what Glassman said. And it's you got to be sensitive. Like you can have an opinion. Like the way I've looked at it, and I haven't really voiced my opinion. It's like you have the right to free speech, but you also have the right to remain silent. You have the responsibility to know which right you should exercise. And it's like, I'm not super well read on it. Like I know some things about a few things. I've read a few books, but again, like all I read is about stuff that even at my level of detail and education formally and through experience in the fitness industry, I'm still reluctant to put stuff out about that. So I'm not going to add to the noise, and like I respect everyone's opinion and their ability and platform to voice it. But it's like, the way I look at social media right now is like, there's a reason Martin Luther marched on Salem. Right. He earned the platform, like literally the podium, right? Logging in and, you know, two-step authenticating your password with Instagram is not verification that you are entitled to a platform. And like, that's my two, and that's why I've remained quiet. But it's a really interesting, like, it's almost a wit. And, you know, there are some way more heinous. I don't know if you know the company Metal.
No.
You know, Metal makes like powerlifting shoes.
Oh yes, of course.
Did you see what came out of Finland?
Oh.
So Elite. I mean, and I'm a proud contributor to Elite FTS. Like I've been an admirer of Dave's work and what they've done since Jump Street. I wouldn't probably be in this position. I would leave Dave Tate and Poliquin when I was 15, 16. That was it. Like Elite FTS as they kind of came to their inception, T-Nation and Poliquin, that was kind of my driving force. And we got an internal memo, and he actually posted it on Instagram, like, we will no longer be selling Metal products. Because again, just and it was heinous. Like that was bad. And I'm like, Dave, that's 30% of their inventory is Metal products, and they just dropped it. But the CrossFit one is, I think it's like I think they had a lot of reasons prior to that, like given recent decisions in the way they're structuring the games and monetizing, you know, external non-sanctioned competitions and getting rid of the regionals, hemorrhaging half of their staff in Santa Cruz, like the half of their. So it's, I think, you know, the pop machine is just one push for a Seinfeld reference from tipping over. And I think that was it.
Well, I think so too. And, you know, like I've never been directly affiliated with CrossFit over the years. I mean, it's not because I actually have anything against them. Like there's a lot of people that were super anti-CrossFit. For me, it just wasn't the wheelhouse that I was operating in, you know? So, but I was always a big fan of the fact that they reintroduced barbells to everyday people, right? So like I'm a huge fan of the fact that they were able to reestablish culture, but I was one of those guys that from the very beginning was like, oh, this is clever. They're making it seem cooler than it is, but the side effect of that is client compliance, right? And I was like, I was all for that. The thing that I'm struggling with today, you know, and not to sound like harsh, but I don't give two shits what happens to CrossFit because it doesn't affect my world. What I don't like is for the last 7 years, there's been people on social media that were so extremely dogmatic to the point where they probably screwed over some people in the social media realm by like ganging up on them. And now I'm actually seeing those same people within 5 seconds completely flip. And one of the comments I read that really caught me off guard was this coach saying CrossFit didn't invent functional fitness, you know, and just the whole like paradigm of statements that I'm like, hold on a second. I remember you tearing apart global gym coaches 5 years ago because you were claiming that you guys invented the functional way to performance. And now you're turned on a dime in less than 24 hours because your cult leader of the Jonestown get-together has poisoned your Kool-Aid, right? Like, I hate to say it, but it is.
It's only people who are going to know the Hong Kong flu that are going to know accurately the gravity of that reference. Well, it's so fun, but I mean, dude, that's just a symptom of a much larger problem, right? That's the symptom of like, you know, this tear it down anti-intelligence movement. Like, I mean, there's no integrity, there's no loyalty, there's no And I think a lot of it, for me, a lot of it stems from a lack of education. And like in our field, having a formal or informal education that's structured teaches you, like, look, every paper I wrote, I had to have a work cited. But that makes me go back into history. The reason I know about the Hong Kong flu is I'm sure I wrote about something at one point that made me go in to an article and say, hey, this is the guy that wrote it, right? This is it. I'm paying it back by paying it forward. So people can be enlightened. And then when I write something, it'll never happen now, but it's the same coach that'll flip on a dime and turn against their Jonestown Kool-Aid mixer. And then it's the same thing you see on a lateral step to people that use mechanisms of capitalism to try and tear it down. It's like, look, man, you can't tear down capitalism with your iPhone. That's not how the game works. Like you can't virtue signal on an 11 in 4K. Right? Like you don't get how this works. Like burn it down, rebuild it, to each according to his ability, to each according to his means. It's like, yeah, go ahead. Go down through the rabbit hole. Check some footnote citations in like Soviet Union in early 1920s. Talk to the Ukraine and see how they're doing. But no, yeah, capitalism's the energy. We got to tear it down. Like I heard in Minneapolis, they got rid of the police force.
This is true. It's been defunded.
What does that mean? Like, you know what it means? It needs more funding. Like you have people, and look, this is how, when I get pulled over, I always think about this, like, because we're both from Canada, and I think policing in Canada is different because teachers in elementary schools are different. Like you get an 100%. Elementary school job, you're set. The quality to the talent pool, you're looking at minimum master's level right now to teach kindergartners how to finger paint, and they're going to get $90K a year, not $100K a year after like 5-10 years. And then and even I think about like the guys I grew up with in Windsor that are cops now. And I think of it every time I got a bunch.
I got a whole family in Windsor that are cops. The whole Snyder family is cops.
Oh, Jesus. All right. Yeah. But I think about these kids when I knew them in high school. So every time I get pulled over, I know who this kid, and he had the same English teacher as me. And he's a smart dude, but it's Stanford Prison Experiment. Like I know what the badge and the gun does. So it's my hands on the wheel. I lower, and I know what I look like. I look like I got 5 kilos in the trunk. Like I know I look like I just crossed the border from Detroit, and I got a bunch of yay under the center console. So yes, sir, no, sir, right away, sir, and it's like I am the most entitled, privileged minority you could be. Great
we
family.
Grew up in Canada.
1% of the 1% of the 1%. But it's like, even I know, like that dude when he was 16 is not going to change. Now he's got a gun and a gang with him. So it's like, yo, it's cool, man. Like I'm not trying to make your day any harder. Right. No. But I think in the States, not to like, I don't want to pick on anyone because I have cops friends, and I'm sure you're the same in the States, that are cops, and they're like the best people you'd ever want to meet. They'd be the first person you'd want to give a badge and a gun to. But like I know friends that are teachers that are really smart, equally as capable and competent, that are getting $45,000 a year.
Yes. So here's interesting. To piggyback on what you're saying, like when, as someone that lives in the United States, like there's a lot of things about the US culture that, especially now as a citizen, that I fully utilize. Some of it because of like some career stuff I do, but I'm a Second Amendment guy. I'm a concealed carry guy. I have all these things that I've gone through the process of becoming. When those red and blues turn on, they're going to see a large dude in a truck, sleeved from finger to shoulder, right? I probably fit a couple demographics that they're looking for, right? If there's a Russian mob in our city, I'm probably going to fit into that one, right? So for me, it's all the cab lights come on in my vehicle. All the windows come down in my vehicle, hands go onto the steering wheel, and I just ride that shit out because I don't want to make it one fraction worse. Because when they punch in my license plate, they're going to see concealed carry owner. They're going to see there could be a gun in the vehicle. All that's going to come up, right? So I'm extremely locked into that. On top of the fact that if I go back 20 years to when I first came down to the U.S. for sports, my first roommate in college, his old man was from Frenchtown, Montana, state highway patrol for the state of Montana. He made $14,500 a year in the late 90s as a police officer for the state of Montana. And so I remember hearing that at the time and being like, that's impossible. How is that possible? And they're like, well, we get a lot of kickbacks from the state for housing and things of this nature, but the wage itself back then was almost non-existent. Now let's jump ahead 15 years to the OPP in Ontario Highway Patrol. A girl that was a friend of mine from Brockville, her family was in the OPP, or what we'd think of as the same as the CHP in California, and entry level career was $89,000 to start. 89, to the point where it made me consider moving back to Canada and going out to Ontario to join the Highway Patrol in Ontario, the provincial police. So, her one cousin was I think he was $118,000 a year as a highway patrolman. That's a legit career that you're going to invest in getting better at.
And think of, I always think of the first spearheaded movement around public safety was the helmet, right? The helmet, right. What it would cost to enforce versus, what you'd save on the back end from incurred damages of having to pick up someone's brains on the highways every year. And I think it was something, it was the benchmark study of public safety intervention. And it was something like a 4 to 5 to 1 return. For every cop you got to pay, for every 20 minutes it takes to stop someone and be like, look, you need to wear a helmet on your motorcycle. I think it was actually done in California. Mm-hmm. It reaped a 4 to 5 to 1 return on the investment of time. Right? So, hey, you got to go get a helmet, or, hey, we're going to provide you with a helmet. Hey, pull that guy over. At the end of a year, there was such a remarkable a decrease in money lost due to time relative to money lost due. It takes way more time to clean up someone's brains off the sidewalk than it does to pull a guy over and be like, dude, you got to wear a helmet. And it's pretty easy to spot enforcement. Right. So I think of the Sandra Bland case. And again, historically, people the memories are so short. It's sound bites and hashtags. It's if you would hear some of this and you remember, because think of a cop that's getting paid $118,000 a year, highway patrol, and then think of the patrolman that pulled over Sandra Bland that led to her inevitable death, right? He's not, I guarantee, I don't know what the going rate in Texas was, but he saw a Chicago license plate. He saw an African-American female, and she saw a cop in a light that she could justifiably see cops in, right? She was an activist in the Black community. She had a YouTube video called YouTube channel called Sandra Speaks or Sandy Speaks. Yep. And she was very vocal for the rights of African Americans. So she felt offended. And I got all this from Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking with Strangers. That's actually the first chapter of his book. And when people have come out to me why haven't you given a statement? It's it's not really my wheelhouse. I know a little bit about a little bit. If we want to have a conversation, this is the book that I found most helpful. And it's imagine if that woman got pulled over with a Chicago license plate on the 401 in Chatham, Kent, right? Halfway from Windsor to Toronto. The guy's making $120 a year. He just wants to go home and nuke his supper. Hey, ma'am, going a little quick. It was fine. Yeah, you're all right. Just have a nice day. Welcome to Canada. Because that guy, he had a grade school teacher that made $100K a year, and he had a high school teacher that was vetted. So for me, the answer is always education. Pain is knowledge really fast. We're all going through some sort of, visceral or collective pain. It's okay, information, knowledge is the issue here. It's defunding the police in Minneapolis. It's what's that? It's not a money issue.
No, it's not. And when I think about it as well, growing up where I did in British Columbia, I was as isolated as you could get. It'd be the equivalent of growing up in the most rural part of the United States, and our area had a reputation because of how rural it was as being very backwoods, right? Kind of less than intelligent folks, didn't finish a lot of high school, even in the 1990s, a lot of my friends didn't push through to the finish, so
got your grade 10 out the door,
got the grade 10 and out the door. And it's funny because when I think back on it, and I try to explain it to people that, aren't familiar with the Canadian system, federalized standard tests. So it didn't matter where you went to school. Most of the teachers in our town were highly educated. They were mostly back then from Vancouver. They came into the interior because they wanted to live in a ski town, but they were all in intellects, right? They were smart people that wanted a better quality of life. And so they taught you advanced information because they knew they got graded as teachers, and the school got graded and funded from the province by how well we did on the federal exams. So nobody wanted stupid students, no matter what school it was or how rural it was. And so when I look back on that, I was a terrible high school student, right? I was I was that kid that, they said probably wouldn't make it to that next level, as they referred to it. You probably won't go to the next level, but that's okay. And I was like, geez. And little did they know I was just, well, shit. I made it through high school and 4 years of university without doing homework, right? I just wasn't into school. But when I look back and try to explain it to people, education is the fundamental, like, even if it's just teaching you how to learn, right? So even once not realizing it at the time, but once I got through school and then I found aptitudes that fascinated me, I didn't realize that I was going to be that A student when I became a non-traditional student years later with therapy and things like that, because I'd actually been taught how to learn. I just didn't dig sitting through civics class.
Well, that's the thing. Like the study of epistemology, I think, is really what you need to teach, right? And it's funny because like I've watched all your stuff. Like we have, you know what it is like, in a romantic comedy, and I've mentioned this in one podcast before, because I have a few friends that we've met in really interesting ways. But we have one of the best meet cute stories of all time. Like when me and Benny, it was me, Ben Pekulski, Alex Viada. We had the crazy idea of
thinking about this today.
taking drugs and climbing a mountain, and so I'm sitting at a table with Ben, who I still like, I looked up to him as a Canadian in Ontario and a meathead, and Alex Viada, who's like a superhuman athlete. There's some sort of dirty, hairy revolver as a centerpiece of the table. It's like, Viada, are we shooting mountain lions or helicopters?
Yes.
Why do I need this 18-inch handgun? Like, I'm gonna have a hard time pulling all 280 pounds of my big ass up this mountain. And then you just happen to be like a stone's throw away.
Purely coincidence.
In getting to know, and then you came by, and I think it was actually my birthday as well. You know what? It's our anniversary.
It's
pretty much because it was June 10th. I remember climbing Cloud Ripper on my birthday,
up to 13,000 feet
years ago.
Yeah,
and you came by, and like obviously through the Poliquin stuff, I knew a bit of your background, but since then I've become more familiar. But you can tell those who, whether or not they've learned the material, in the way people deliver content and teach, they know how to learn, because there's an empathetic way of delivery. Like your Sorinex presentation, I think it was last year, and you tell the story about, from Coeur d'Alene into like the diamond thief in the middle of the Maldives. It's like, and there's overarching message and principles, but it's like that storytelling only comes from people that know how to learn, because they know how to teach, rather than like, here's a bunch of slides. Like the slide had one word on it, and then all of a sudden we're in the Middle East, or we're on tour with Zach Brown. Like, because I think, our podcast, we're doing a podcast now, by the way. I guess this just started when the phone answered. I was like, we'll like riff a bit, we'll banter, and we'll do an intro. I was like, fuck that. But it's like with you, like on the pure nerding outside of things, like the information, the programming. Like I used to love the assault bike breakdowns in Saudi Arabia. Like you're talking about, here's my RPMs, here's what I'm doing this week, here's how we're going to wave it into the next week, here's how we're concurrently programming. This is the micro, meso, macro goals. And I was just like, this is fucking unreal. But like, I think in the way that, like, just the nature of the conversation, like your decision-making process to me is, but the first thing that comes to mind is just hilarious. Like, because people are like, I'm in a weird place, but like really, like I just think about your career, and like I've said yes to some things where I'm just like, oh boy, like the words leave my mouth, and I'm just like, oh god, okay. Like I found myself 2 years ago in the middle of Lebanon with no money and no ability to speak the language, and I was like, okay, Lebanon is kind of Middle East light. I'm gonna be all right, but why the fuck did I say yes to this? But like your corpus of work, your story is like, fuck, Derek said yes. This is a pretty crazy shit. And the only thing I can describe your decision-making process without knowing its inner workings is like, it's hilarious. Because it's basically like, yeah, fuck it. See what happens.
See what happens. It's like, I'm notorious for telling people that I've force got myself through so much shit. So, and when I go all the way back to getting into the U.S. college system, to having success as an athlete, to being on Team Canada and doing all that stuff. And then there's like a pause because, in 2008, when the economy took a shit, I was trying to open a gym in Cleveland at the time, right? Cleveland, Ohio, of all places. the gym did not do well, right? And so we shut that down. I went back to school, became a therapist, bumped into the Poliquin world, started traveling the world with Poliquin, doing all that stuff. But that now is almost a decade ago, right? And so it's like when I try to explain to people, like, what's the best way I can describe it is if someone was to say, what's the weirdest thing that's happened in the last 7 years as a professional strength coach? And I'd be like, well, having my client's father thrown out of power in the first modern coup in history, and then having my conversation in a gym show up in the Washington Post 2 days later, knowing that there was nobody around to record it. So it could have only been recorded from out in the Red Sea by, I don't know, a naval ship, or perhaps my cell phone, which I know to be true, was being monitored by some sort of government body. And it's like, so what does that have to do with weightlifting? Everything and nothing, right? Like it's just, it became an avenue for opportunities that have put me in all these bizarre worlds. Like I've lived through rocket attacks as a strength coach. That's very unexpected.
That was one of the conversations I remember when we first met in person, was like, I could tell the difference between an RPG and a Scud missile just by the noise. And I was like, I don't even know. I think that was in Saving Private Ryan. I don't know what that is.
I don't know what that means.
What the fuck?
I remember one day we were being attacked, and how I could tell that it was a significant explosion was by how the birds evacuated the area, because animals are just instinctual. And so the concussion was massive. And it was the first real big explosion that we had in around Riyadh. And I remember the princess was like, that had to have been an IED. Like her brain was already trying to solve it, because she had lived through the first Gulf War when they were shooting missiles at Saudi from Iraq. And she was like, oh, that had to be an IED. It's too close. It's too close. It was so like the concussion just goes into your body. And so that was my first. And I was like, oh, that was intense, right? And so over the next 3 years, because of the war with Yemen that Saudi was in, and the Houthi rebels were being funded by all these different organizations, because everything becomes a proxy war. And so probably Iran, probably some people associated with them were getting bigger and bigger ordnance into Yemen. And the Houthis were just shooting them into the country. One girl that worked for me from South Africa, she was getting, and this is the difference. So this is really an interesting thing to think about. This is the difference between over there and here. She was at King Khalid Airport and getting ready to depart, and they saw the missile impact just outside of the airport, and it made all the windows of this massive airport, think Heathrow or any of these big airports, it made the windows wave like water. Like it was a significant explosion. And alarms go off for a few minutes, everyone panics. 30 minutes later, the planes were still departing from the airport. Right? And they didn't stop it for the day. They didn't do a huge investigation. They were just like, fuck it, nothing happened. Let's get these people out of here. And I was like, and I didn't even know. I was in Riyadh and I knew there'd been a missile hit near the airport. I didn't realize she hadn't taken off yet. And she saw it happen. And so the psychology is so much different when you live in a place like that. And so the next trip I came in, I remember like landing at the airport. This is like 2 months later. And I look out the window to where I used to live in this area. And I'm like, why are all those dump trucks sitting out there with their dumps up, right? With their backs up. And my driver, Hamad, is like, he's like, no. He goes, he like, his English wasn't great. He's like, how do you say Patriot? And I'm like, Patriot missiles? And I'm like, pull over. So he stops and I look and I'm like, holy shit. I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. We're been getting hammered by missile attacks that are getting bigger, so they can fly further into the country from the southern border. So they're having to set up Patriot batteries all over the place. So that's when things started to get weird. And so we started to get rocketed quite consistently. So we got rocketed so consistently with large size incoming from Yemen that I was able to distinguish the sound in time and get out and film the Patriots exploding over the city. Right? It's like I was able to be like, oh, we're being attacked. I got to get out and check this out. Right? And it was weird because the entire time that all this was happening in my brain, I was like, oh, this is crazy. This is crazy. And then I would come home, and at the time I was single. So I would come back to the US, get back into my routine. Now I look back on all these habits that I started to develop during this time. This would be about 2 years ago when it was at its worst. I don't gamble, started gambling. Right. When I came home from these trips, I started spending huge amounts of time in casinos, and I couldn't figure out why. So I started playing blackjack, learned how to play blackjack, did like weird stuff like this. I still don't drink, but I didn't drink then. So that none of that stuff really happened. And then I meet Megan, and she starts to like become a part of my life. And I'm still going over there and coming home. And I didn't realize until she started staying over at the house that I was suffering like the physical manifestation of hypervigilance PTSD. So, and I had no clue. I would wake up in my front room swinging a pillow. I would do all the stuff that I didn't know was happening. And then one really hit home. She introduced me to a TV show on Showtime. It'll come to me, but it's about a CIA agent and terrorism and stuff. Homeland. And there's a scene in Homeland where this kid is like, he's like an Afghani kid sleeping, but he's guarding this American soldier, but he's sleeping on the floor. And as he's sleeping, his body's just agitating and shaking like he's in a wash machine. And I'm like watching it. And this was like 3 months ago. And I go to Megan, I'm like, hey, I go, did I used to do that? And she goes, yeah, we talked about this. And I'm like, yeah, but I don't really remember it. She goes, you used to shake so violently in your sleep that it would shake me to the edge of the bed. And I had no knowledge that this was happening. And what it was is my body just couldn't shut down from that nervous system stimulation. And so I realized, I started to come to the realization that the reason I was going to the casino was the lights and the sound and the human interaction was like this massive stimulatory effect, because I was actually, and it was really hard. And thank God I have a lot of friends that were with like special operations and special forces that I could talk to about this, that there was a part of me that really liked it, but my body couldn't deal with it. So I would like suppress it, and then it would show up in the sleep disturbances and all this weird stuff. And then when I realized that there was something amok is when I had a break from going over there for a long time. I wasn't, I'd gone from literally flying either to Saudi, from Saudi, once every 30 days for 7 years. Right. And that was after doing the 200 days a year on the road with Poliquin to Europe and Canada and Australia and whatever, Dominican. So I've been in constant motion. And so it was interesting when I had gotten back from traveling overseas a lot, which, I still work over there. We're just on hiatus. But what was crazy is I was actually getting on a trip to go to like Summer Strong or something. It was like a real casual trip domestically. And no one had ever lived with me before. So like 2 days before, we started to like kind of have this weird friction in the house, and I couldn't figure it out. She certainly couldn't figure it out. And it kept getting worse. And then she calls me on it, and I'm like, huh. And then I'm like, holy shit, my subconscious is getting ready. It's getting ready to go over to a place where I have to be, because I drove myself all over the Middle East. I didn't have a driver after a while. I'd worked into there where, you're aware of everything, right? Like, because they're still, they do a good job of keeping things safe over there, but it's not that safe, right? Like we were still having issues with Daesh when I was over there, or what we think of as ISIS, turning on Saudis turning on Saudis and killing each other. And there was still, shootings in certain cities, and you couldn't go to the south of the country because the Yemenis were attacking it so heavily, or the Houthis in particular. So like when you look at all that stuff, you get really good at existing in environments that are really sketchy, right? And you get good at it really quickly as a human. And that's something, coming from small town Canada, I never thought I would ever experience by accident.
I think the interesting contrast is like because those like I was the same to obviously a lot lesser degree when I was in the Middle East, but like what they're able to normalize. And even after that desensitization period, if you have a head on your shoulders, has to happen quick. Otherwise you just have anxiety attack and you end up in the hospital, you end up on a plane getting out of there, right? It's like you're stepping over mortar shells from the war 30 years ago. And it's like, I remember them thumbing through my passport in the Lebanese airport, or in the Beirut airport, checking to see if I'd ever been to Israel.
Yes.
Because they would have turned me back right away. I was like, whoa, Dorothy, we're a long way from Kansas here, man. But it's like because there are things that they over normalize that are actually a present danger that they have to suppress, because it's not a country full of people that are tossing and turning, right? Like
100%. And
you're there for, you fly in, you fly out, but they're there 24/7, 365 for their whole life. So like the coping, I always think about the London Blitz in the war, how like they thought the bombing would break the spirits of the people in London, but it actually like started to fortify them and like get them used to it, and like, we're still not dead. So that actually they attribute in part to the success of the Allied forces to that London Blitz, because like the Germans thought that they could break down the spirits by driving them into the tunnels and bombing the streets. And a lot of people died, but on the other end of it, the people that didn't die, they were like roaches. They were they just can't die.
Can't die. And not only that, when you look at a book like Tribe, where you're referring to when they viewed these people following those experiences, there was a gelling that occurred. Like some people felt guilty to admit that they actually had a better sense of life when they were all sleeping head to foot, shoulder to shoulder in the tunnels of England, right? Because they felt like they were a part of something bigger than them. They felt a sense of community so much greater than what they were used to. And it's a weird psychology, right? Like, and I'm very honest about this. Like it is amazing how quickly your tolerance for, it's shocking how quickly I stopped giving a shit about whether or not it was politically correct or incorrect to be fighting the Houthis. Like I became very aware of who they were very quickly. And I became extremely aware of the fact that I no longer had a single thought about whether or not it was right or wrong. When I realized that somebody was trying to kill me indiscriminately without, like, it's like your ego gets a weird check, right? Like you're standing there and you're like, oh, these people don't give a fuck about me. Like Derek Woodske has no significance to this situation. Like if that missile lands on me, they will not even have a synapse fire in their brain that thinks that that was a bad thing. Well, I see it in the kingdom of self as all the people that it'll affect, all the relationships, all the fallout of it would be horrific. Now they don't feel anything. And it was weird, like by the second or third attack, when the news would report that, there'd been fighting and this many Houthis had been killed in a bombing run, I would just be like, there was no acknowledgement. And I know before that, I was very aware because I was concerned about the fallout of all the fighting. I was like, man, this war, they can't do this. Too many innocent people are going to be killed in this. And then by the third major rocket attack, I realized that the empathy that I had for this situation wasn't coming to the forefront of my mind anymore. I was like, oh, I get it. It's us against you. Yeah, this sucks. Well,
have you ever read Alex Hutchinson's, and I refer to this book a lot, Endure?
I know it, but I haven't read it.
So he talks about physiological safeguards, right? Like core body temperature, basically, are we like, people thought for some reason that the only partial pressure of oxygen that the human being could withstand was at a certain altitude, happened to resemble the exact altitude of the summit of Everest. So like, yeah, it's a little too convenient. Maybe the limitations are actually in our psychology, that we know not elevations higher than this. Well, I think of like, because to think about the current situation, and you talked about the gelling effect that happened, and as referenced in Tribe when the London Blitz during the war. And I think whether it's empathy or sympathy, I mean, empathy is obviously like a very powerful tool. If you're like, any clinician can attribute to the power of empathy, like, or even I think to a certain degree, sympathy. Like if you haven't been in a situation, saying, I don't know how that feels versus I know how that feels can be of equal weight and magnitude. And like you see that now. And I think that's where a lot of people who aren't necessarily in marginalized groups, who may have not been as well read on the systemic oppression of the, like African Americans in the United States, there's a gelling effect in that community that like, look, I played street hockey until the lights came on with my friends, and I went home and I slept in my own room forever. I never shared a room with my sister. We would wake up, we would have breakfast, and we would go. And it's like, there was I don't even think I ever seen my parents fight, not to brag, but to be sympathetic to the fact that I'm not from a culture that has a gelling effect behind like this survival mechanism of gelling behind this. Like, look, the enemy of the enemy is thy friend. Like anyone they create that divisive line between like, and it's just a survival mechanism, right? So like a lot of people, like when they're voicing their political standpoint on the current issues, especially around the George Floyd and the riots in the United States and the Black Lives Matter movement, it's like, and that's why I don't talk about it often. It's like, I don't know, but I've read about the unification that happens. It's almost like it would almost like a Stockholm syndrome in a sense, but your captors are, it's like you're creating a relationship, not exactly with your captors, but with everyone else in the bank vault. Like you're becoming friends with everyone else that's trapped in. And like, I forget what the names of the tribes. It's in Africa, and there's two tribes that they're the same, taxonomy, genealogy down to like phylum. They're the same people. Right. But one is like the people, like their tribe name is the people, and the other is the God's people, and it has nothing to do with color. But there's a divisive line and scarcity of resource that's just drawn from survival instinct, that it's like, you have no idea how unified that tribe is. And like, there's proof of genetic expression of oppression being passed on, right? So that unity is actually like, it's not a banner, it's not a hashtag, it's actually like ingrained into the physiology and biochemistry and genetic makeup of people. So like, at the very best, I can be sympathetic and be like, look, I've kind of read this stuff, and I think it relates to this. Because like, I have friends that are African American that had great lives, but they still feel a certain level of oppression with that group unity that I don't think I'll ever really feel. And like, I'm not, amplified melanated voices. I'm not like silencing myself or anything like that. I'll speak to what I know and have experienced, but it's an interesting like way of lateral thinking between like, your experience in the Middle East, and like, you can almost judge yourself in a way that like, man, that's a pretty cold blank affect to have about like the Yemenis versus the Saudis. And you're a guest, but as far as you're concerned, you're on team Saudi and that's team Yemen. But it's like, I think when I look at that book and like physiological safeguards, and I guess this would be like a psychophysiological safeguard, you have to have a blank affect, right? You have something. Yeah. And it's and some people, I think Canada, knowing like you talk about special operations or like CSOR guys, like I think Canada does a good job in preparing people for that to a better degree. Like I obviously have friends in both, like, you have Delta Force, SEAL team, all that in the States, and we have CSOR in Canada, but like, you have to kind of know that affect is there to protect you. And I think a lot of people get very critical of themselves, like, oh no, like, why don't I feel anything? Because if you felt anything, you'd be crippled by the amount of like shame and guilt. So it's like, you're welcome. You'll shake a bit at night, and hopefully that's the rest of it. But recognizing that and having that awareness, I think, is something that a lot of people are missing in like this current landscape, because they've never been tested with anything. Like, we live pretty comfortable lives.
And it's funny that you say that, because I try to stay equally distanced from the situation because of how I grew up as well. I grew up in a slightly more multicultural area for as rural as it was. Because of where I grew up, we had the first Sikh temple in Canada, even though we were in the middle of nowhere. Makes no sense, correct? Right? Like a Swiss founded town had one of the first Sikh temples. So my high school was probably 30-40% mix. Back then we weren't as aware because everyone was trying to be Canadian, but probably 30-40% either Indian or Pakistani, right? So, for me growing up, mixed race school, high school was totally normal. Now, we didn't have any African Canadians, but we had plenty of races from around the world. So I never really thought about it much. And then when I came to the US, I, obviously came for sports. So, I became integrated into that team setting with African-American kids, many of which have become lifelong friends. And then I worked in the NFL, and you get an even more realistic dose because now you're working with such a diverse group of athletes from all over the United States. And they did not all have good upbringings, right? Their stories were much different than even the kids I went to college with. And even with all of that, I still can't identify with what they went through. It's so much different than how I grew up. I can listen, and hopefully I'm a good listener to the situations that they're dealing with, but I can't tell them how to feel. And what's really interesting about it is, obviously years later, 7 years ago it started, when I first went overseas to live in a country where, someone asked me one time what it was like. And I'm like, well, they're very accepting, right? But I'm a micro minority in this country. So there's no one else like me. So if I'm there for 60 days, not only am I a Westerner, which is the first level of separating me from them, because you're looking at, historical differences related to religion, which are massive, right? So I'm a Westerner. So that from the beginning, they acknowledge, because even if you're an Arabic male born in Canada, they still look at you differently than an Arab born on Arab land, right? So you have to understand that part of it. So I was a Westerner. Even though I'm not a particularly outgoing religious person, I'm identified as Christian, more so, for sure I'm not Muslim, right? So, I don't understand Islam at all from the religious standpoint. So there's another separation category. So now not only am I Westerner, but now I'm non-Islamic faith. So I moved 2 giant steps away from them. And then I'm Northern European. So I look like nobody I'm going to speak with for the entire time I'm there. In 7 years of working there, the entire 7 years, there was only one other person that was either not Filipino, Pakistani, a fair number of Chinese because of the workforces, or Arabic that I associated with. So when you're in that situation and you want to enjoy it, right, and become culturally connected to the experience, you have to ditch your connection to the things that separate you as quickly as possible. Now, there's some, I'm not going to get rid of, like I believe in my own personal religious systems. I'm a, people say spiritual, but I don't even know if I'm so much spiritual. I believe that there's a God. I believe that there's a something, a big thing, it could be a mothership. I don't know. But, right. I know that I don't identify with the Islamic faith from a religious standpoint. So I'm not going to make that shift. I'm not going to start going to a mosque. It's just not me. But aside from that, I'm not going to do very well in a country as a micro minority if I have all these hangups related to being a white male from Canada, right? Because if I'm walking around this country constantly telling people, well, in Canada, it's like this, or where I'm from, this is how it was, you're an asshole. B, you're going to have one of the worst human experiences that you could possibly have. You won't get integrated into their culture. You won't develop any friendships. You won't learn to understand what it is to be a Bedouin from the, empty quarter. And you may not even really develop a long-term friendship with that person, but you have to understand enough of who you are and your limitations to be able to sit down across from somebody who literally has lived in an empty desert for 55 years, but he speaks English and he's extremely wise. And he will tell you stories that will completely change how you look at the universe. And if you hang on to something as simplistic as what you were born into and where you're from, you will never get to experience that conversation.
I think so many people get hung up on, because they don't have, like you said, like you have like an awareness, like sense of self, and kind of like have your core values, call it spirituality, call it religion, call it what have you. But like, I think too many people are propped up on the vertices of their intersectionality. That is like,
right,
as they intersect as a white male who's also going to be deemed as a Christian, that intersects again with, you know, being Western European, and then being in a place where none of those people are there. Like, if that's your identity, and that's half of the issue in a lot of, like, I think the peripheral as far as overall, I mean, it's a lot of the noise you see in the microcosm and the silo of social media, but I think in the grand scheme of things, in relative percentages, the number of people that are propping up their viewpoints off of the ideologies that are built on these very weak wireframes of intersectionality. And it's like, I can't help but bring it back to teaching. Like, when you're talking to a room, like I went from teaching or being a chiropractor in a corporate setting and at Apple's world headquarters in Cupertino, California, where it's like, you want to talk liberal microcosm in liberal microcosm inside of the liberal microcosm. It's like, I'm inside of Apple. First off, that's a culture in itself. Inside Cupertino, California, which 117 mailing addresses are owned by the Apple Corporation. Inside of the Silicon Valley, inside the San Francisco Bay Area, inside of California, it's like
Silicon socialism.
So siloed, and it's not a real experience. Like, you're living in the 5th largest economy in the world, and it's
perfect life.
Yeah, it's insane. But you walk into a room and it's like, you know, I'm not going to be a Democrat in one room and like a classic libertarian in another. But but like, if some people they're propped up on the outer borders of their identities, of their marginalizations or groups or ideologies that they sort of base their sound bites on. But at the same time, it's like, I had to be a Jordan at, I don't know, I used to bald and like skinhead looking guy, right? Like, I look like
the genetic scissor, right?
Right. And I'm walking in and there's a 28-year-old, barely speaks English, Muslim software engineer there with her husband. And it's like, oh boy.
Right.
How do I navigate this one?
Yeah. You know, you're going to be putting hands on somebody who fundamentally you're going against everything they've ever been taught. Yeah. You're crossing boundaries that most of us will never, ever have to navigate.
Well, it's thousands and thousands of years old, right? And so I'm trying to navigate a social situation. And again, like, I'm still me, but I'm not me. Like, all of and I'm trying to tear down the outer portrayals of these intersecting or these intersectionalities of like, oh shit, white male, young, and like, dude, I lived in California. I worked at Stanford University during the Brock Turner case.
Right.
Are you serious? I would handcuff myself walking through campus. Like, I'll get on the phone and act like I would literally, if I was walking through the parking lot at night after that case, because that kid is, I mean, a full-time piece of shit. And I think the justice system clearly failed in that case. And the idea of affluenza, as he got off with, 6 months of house arrest and somewhere in the Midwest, is bullshit. But I would get, like, if I was walking through the parking lot at night after a session with the team, and there was like a female walking in front of me, I know what I look like. The same way I know what I look like when a cop pulls me over and it's like, this guy's got a Beretta in the glove box. I know that, you know, this guy kind of looks weird. I don't know, like, he's kind of a big guy. I would get on the phone, even if my mom didn't answer. Hey mom, how's it going? Yeah, just got off work, just headed home, gonna walk the dog. And it's like, there was no one on the other line. Dude. But like, I had to like have that awareness of like, look, these are, whether or not I choose, I mean, I choose to look this way. I you know, I bring it down low on the sides. I taper the beard. I try and take care of it. But like, I also choose to be 200 at the time. I was like 275. I wear J's. I'm probably 6 foot. It's like that's hopefully scares most men in an alley, let alone a girl walking at night through campus that just had a very public and open sexual assault case go pretty much unjustly tried. So it's like, I think people need to, again, exercise your responsibility rather than lean. Like, I could have the right to like walk up right behind, like, oh, I'm not doing anything.
Yeah.
I'm just walking in my car. What are you doing?
Yeah, it's your problem, not mine, right?
Yeah, it's like, no. Like, come on, we're all in this together. Like, I'd be like, I'd call again if they didn't answer. They didn't. Oh, hey, what's going? Hey, yeah, how you doing, man? Like, just be like over the top. Like, look, I literally in my apartment complex. I lived in California during all this. I parked in it was a big complex, hard to find parking on the street. I ended up parking at the same time as another woman. We were walking in the same direction. I was behind her because she got out of her car first.
Yeah.
And I could hear, like, I could see the key go between the fingers.
Absolutely.
Ma'am, I live in 1654, 60 Descanso Drive. I'm just going to, you know what, you do your thing. Because, like, dude, I'm going to get pepper sprayed. And it's going to be 100% my fault.
So, yeah, well, I talk about the awareness of self so much as, like, if everybody's an asshole in the room and you're not, you're probably the one asshole and everyone's fine, right? So but I talk about self-awareness so much because of this. Like, so when I look at how, from a social interaction standpoint, Swedish German heritage, lost my hair early, even though it was white blonde, so it didn't matter anyway. I don't tan, right? So like, you can already see where I'm going with this. I started not knowing, having any clue what I was getting into. I started my collegiate career in the United States in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Coeur d'Alene, Idaho in the late 1990s is the connecting community to what is now quite a beautiful estate area, but was Hayden, Idaho. Hayden, Idaho was the training center for the white supremacists, right? So all the neo-Nazis that were training up for whatever alt-right movement they were doing back in the late 90s were based in northern Idaho. I don't have a clue of this, of course, coming down from Canada. So it was probably within 6 months of my first year. And I was kind of like really into this like sprinter from Jamaica that I was spending all this time with, right? So it really threw the locals for a loop that I was hanging out with this, like, at the time, what I thought was a smoking hot, trackster, right? Winning the lottery with this Jamaican chick. And at the same time, I looked like I was leading the marches for the other side, right? And so probably about month 7, month 8, she calls me and she's like, we had an incident at our apartment, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, what happened? She goes, I don't know. Like, she's not American, right? She's like, I don't know. It's some weird bullshit. So I go over and yeah, man, like swastika bullshit carved into the door of their apartment, a knife stuck in it, the whole 9, right? That year in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, the white supremacists marched down Main Street on Hitler's birthday. So that was my introduction to what we now think of as the racial conflict in American society, right? So I was like, holy shit, what an eye-opener at 18. So I spent my 2 years there. It was an amazing 2 years in Coeur d'Alene because the people turned against the supremacists that were there, and they used politics properly to arrest those that they could, and then they forced out and investigated the rest out of the area and did the best thing you could possibly do. Took a bunch of uninhabited land in a beautiful area and turned it into golf courses and houses. Took care of the problem, right? So that was a good way to do it. But then so my scholarship then bumps me up to the University of Wyoming. Again, Forrest Gump shit. It was 3 months I was at the University of Wyoming. Matthew Shepard was murdered. The hate crime that completely changed legislation nationwide for violence against gay men and women. So I was at Wyoming, the murder of Matthew Shepard. They found him tangled in a barbed wire fence in the wilds of Wyoming, beat to death. So I'm like, what the fuck is this? Like, this is blowing my small town Canadian mind. I don't understand this. Reverend Phelps came in from Kansas, and I dare use the term reverend. The guy's a fucking demon. He comes in with all his extremists with their giant signs that have the most horrific things about homosexuality and anti-gay rights and anything you could imagine. Like, think of the worst things that you could possibly put on a sign, and then give it to a 7-year-old girl and make her hold it in front of the campus union, right? So I'm watching all this in real time. I don't know how to comprehend it. It's so different than where I've grown up with. And then I saw the most amazing thing. And I wish, social media didn't exist really back then at all. Internet was kind of around. But I wish that there was a way to capture the spirit of the people that stood up against these extremists. And so they had all their signs out, and they had the right to protest and all that bullshit, which is a real giant question mark sometimes. And they're, chanting and doing all this stuff. And out of this, like, one area of the university, probably 30 or 40 men and women showed up dressed as angels with giant, elaborate wings. And they looked beautiful. Like, I don't know what they spent on these costumes. And I was like, what is this? This is so weird, right? So I just stopped. I'm like, small town kid from Canada. I'm like, I got to watch. This is world history, right? So I'm watching, and they set up in a way in a peaceful, silent protest, and their costumes made it impossible for the news to be able to see the protesters that were radicals. All you could see was this wall of angel wings. It was fucking amazing. And it was one of those moments for me where I was like, okay, I get how this works. There's some real pieces of shit that exist on this planet. And I don't know if I will ever be a voice for the masses. I don't know if I'll ever be someone that gets into a social platform where I speak on this stuff all the time. I don't care. I love coaching. I love athletics. I love human performance. From that moment forward, I remember thinking to myself, I take everybody as the individual word, no matter who they are, what their background is, what their life experiences are. If I interact with them as a human, person to person, and I really put a lot of energy from that point forward into human interpersonal communication, dynamic, and understanding, I'm like, get to know the individual, understand the situation. If they're a bad person, you're going to have to discard them, and you can't keep them aboard your train, wherever that train's going. But if they're a good person, regardless of how complicated their life seems to society, then you're just going to have a little more interesting train, and everybody else has to kind of deal with that reality.
I think that's the difficult part, is like, if you don't have that, like, you talk a lot about awareness of self. If you don't have that, then you can't see that, like, there's a divisive line. Like, I think it's a Jungian idea of, like, the shadow self. And if you've ever gone deeper into his stuff, and to what degree you can, because some of it is so abstract and over my head that it's like, holy fuck. But, like, good people, bad people. And, like, it's that line runs right through the individual, right? It doesn't run through collective groups. But it's like, if you think about a thought in your head, which is like a weird sentence to say, a thought doesn't exist in a single synapse in a brain, right? It's a culmination of thoughts. And it's almost like this meme theory idea of, like, just as, like, there's a collective outer shell, like a valence a veil of, like, and not to say, like, there aren't people who almost wholly inhabit the idea in one single self, but, like, it's the accumulation of neurons and synapses in a brain can make a thought that's actually worth being conscious or available to be conscious about. In a more, like, when we look at, like, these group ideologies and we start to label these different, lefts versus rights, blues versus reds, elephant versus donkeys, Jets versus the Patriots, like, when you start to divide it up in this, like, line, it's almost like something at, like a Burning Man. It's just an outer shell. Like, there's nothing in it but hollow ideas and people. And, like, you can look back to the early 1940s in Germany and be like, hey, there was one guy that in his head, the majority of those thoughts stemmed, and he was very much the nucleus of the outer valence periphery that acted on this one single thought. But I think now what we're seeing is, like, no one is in a position to nominate a thought leadership, right? The accessibility of platform and the the total disregard to pedigree, to affording and earning that platform is gone with social media. Like, we're all on an equal a podium of sorts. So we don't have the ascension of Martin Luther's and Malcolm X's and things like that. So because we don't have a nominated voice, and the nominated voices that we have, frankly, like, Trump actually released a speech the other day. It's like, you shouldn't be bullied into doing a speech by Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. I mean, I fear the people's elbow as much as anyone else. Don't get me wrong, but like, that shouldn't be your deciding factor. Say what you want about Bush, say what you want about Obama. Like, they were really good orators in time of crisis, but it's like, we do have elected officials that are dropping the ball. And you talked about, like, look, the way to enlightenment was through political organization and change. And now, Coeur d'Alene and surrounding and Hayden are now, not that. But I don't think that, I mean, it's a tough conversation as far as, like, First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fifth Amendment. It's like balancing those three. And I think so it comes down to the responsibility of, like you said, like, okay, get to know the individual, because there's so many people that are on the other side being like, the default to guilt is something that Malcolm Gladwell talks about in his book, Talking with Strangers. And the default to guilt is what ultimately led to, I think, like, George Floyd's like tragic death. Was there was a default to him being guilty of something, whether that something was guilty of being African American, right? Like, that guy's obviously a piece of shit, but the default of guilt now is being portrayed like, oh, if you're not saying something, it's like, whoa, hey, guys, do you know me? Have you talked to me about it? Like, don't default to guilt, because that core essence is at the root of the misunderstanding when we communicate with one another, because we communicate on behalf of this outer valence of a group thought process rather than the outer valence of whatever that core of the self-awareness is. It's really interesting to see it play out now, like, because the only catalyst, like, when we go back to the Hong Kong flu, we go back to Woodstock, to 1969, the launch into space and the man on the moon. And we go to now, the only variable, the only exponent in this equation is the social media machine.
That's it.
Like, the equation is the same.
The equation is the exact same. And it's like, taking it full circle back to you bringing up the fact that they're talking about Minneapolis depolicing the city. And, the proposed ideas that I've seen that have been kind of presented is, we will still have a very small group of officers that are directly responsible for violent crime, right? Small group. We will have community policing that will ensure the well-being of the people within the individual, blocks, or however they break it up. And the thing that was concerning to me, and maybe this is just me not understanding, but I hope I do. The thing that was concerning to me was the one related to mental health issues. They believed that instead of using police to deal with mental health crime, that they would have mental health workers that would go and deal with that situation. And that was something that was proposed in this one person from the council in Minneapolis when they started to question them. And, there hasn't been a lot of follow-up on it. This is just like probably a lot of them throwing stuff against the chalkboard to see what sticks. But, when I think of mental health crime, that's our most horrific violent crime in America. And I understand what they're trying to say by grouping everybody with a mental health disturbance, like from the homeless man that is screaming on the street of San Francisco, that's really not a threat to anyone. He's just no longer himself. Okay, yeah, a tactical police squad's probably not necessary to help that person, but the guy who was on the Greyhound in Canada that cut the guy's head off and ate his eyeball, there was not a single trigger that you could have identified as that person about to behead a human on a bus and cannibalize him.
Well, look more recently at what happened in Halifax.
Yes, like everyone's talking about gun rights in Halifax, and no one's talking about the fact that this guy had a police cruiser perfectly done up so it looked official and a uniform. Okay, that's such a bigger issue than the fact that he was able to illegally get his hand on a gun. Like, you know how much harder it is to get a police car? I'm not positive, but I think it's harder, right? Like, holy shit. The psychological dysfunction of a dentist, right, that decides he's going to just kill everybody. So you're going to send a social worker to deal with those people. So I think they need to step back and kind of like, I get where they're coming from this, and it'll bring me back to something I was thinking when we first started talking about this is I understand that it's a person's fear of the militarization of the police force of America. That's really what they're talking about. We don't want a militarized police force. Okay, I understand that. Having lived in countries where the military does the policing, it's weird, right? You do feel the sense that nothing you do is invisible, okay? Granted, with that being said, it's weird how quickly you get used to it. So I understand that, but it's like the difference between, someone explained to me one time, the difference between Western American culture and Western Canadian culture. In the west of the United States during the founding years, it's like the outlaws went first and the adventure seekers found the West before everybody else. So they dealt with the law with the revolver and the fists, right? That's how they settled the West. Whereas in Western Canada, they sent the RCMP before they sent anybody else. So like the RCMP kind of were always there. Like they're like the original unsung adventurers. So there was a sense of law in Canada from coast to coast before there was population, right? And the idea now that in 2020 that somehow we can return to a Wild West govern yourself ideology almost seems science fiction-ish. Like I just can't see
Orwellian.
I don't see how it's going to work, because even if you're driving through Nevada, and this is an area because of my family history that I still struggle with, probably 50% of my extended family is either First Nations or married to First Nations, right? Just where I grew up in BC, a lot of my uncles and my aunts are Native Canadians. So, like my parents' house is on an Indian reservation, although they are not native blood. So it's just, I've grown up around First Nations my whole life. And so it's interesting because like you drive through Nevada, and I got pulled over last year by the tribal police, right? And it's their own police forces that govern the reserves within certain boundaries, and they take care of it, and all the speeding tickets and all those things. All that money goes back into the reserve itself, and they hopefully use it to the betterment of the people. But that is such a complicated ask, and there's so many levels to that you still go back to the same problem. And the problem is, are the police that are doing the policing trained well enough to deal with the situation? So it's like, yeah, we can use that as a potential case study of, certain groups of America self-policing or self-electing people to be the police. And it might work because Native American tribes do it. But the actual process has to still go through an academy and an education and an understanding. And it just brings you back to the same problem with just different people doing the job.
Right. And I think in speaking to that, and I think that's where a lot of my sympathy around cultural disparity comes from, is being a little bit more educated on the history of marginalization of Aboriginals in Canada, like Native Canadians in Canada. Like I started my academic career studying history and political science, and I was deeper into the Aboriginal studies, especially in Western Canada. Like, read about the Manitoba School Act and the assimilation through there. And then, again, the history repeating itself. You don't need to be premonitious. You don't need a crystal ball.
No.
Like, well, we've been down this road before, right? And again, that's where a lot of the sympathy is built out from. But, I can't help but think when I heard the defund and then the community policing itself, it's like, dude, 2 weeks later or 3 weeks before that, you had a kid get gunned down in a neighborhood. What do you think those guys were doing? They were self-policing. Trayvon Martin 4 years ago was running through Florida with a hoodie on with Skittles in his pocket. What do you think those guys were doing? Right? That was, I think there's a weird default to the better angels of our nature, to like rip an Abe Lincoln quote, where it's, and I think some people, if the ideas in their head are more towards the greater good, it's like, how much are you betting on that your neighbor is John McClane from Die Hard, shout out Bruce Willis, or how much are you betting on that your neighbor is, like trying to fulfill the American dream of killing someone and getting away with it, right? And I think
exactly.
Like there's an entropic, like when I read like the Milgram study, when you read the Stanford prison experiment, there's an entropic chimp-like nature that in that 1.8% difference in our genes, we're more alike than different. And it's like, I don't know if the default is to good, right?
I don't know if it is either.
And
I think it's the opportunity.
Right. And that's what you're doing is like, so the defund is like, no, refund, more fun, like better. Because look, you compared at the beginning, like the highway patrol making 118 G's, contrast that to, I think it was like Southern Texas, where that highway patrolman, I mean, I don't know his W-2s, what his tax statements were that year that Sandra Bland died on his watch, but it's like, I don't think he's pulling 120 USD a year, right? So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, man. But it's definitely, people like to use the word that it's unprecedented, and I think that incites even more fear. It's like, no. There's precedents that's been set. There's precedents that need to change, and we have the ability to set a new precedent. But this is in no way unprecedented. I think the only thing that maybe changes the current narrative or the landscape is the social media machine, right? But
that's what I'm hoping as well. I'm hoping that maybe for the first time that we can't fall back on our default short memories, right? I hope that people are like, oh, okay, hold on a second. Last time we did this, it ended badly. We can't do this anymore, right? And that's what I'm hoping. Like, and I've heard these stories, having worked in different sports categories where African Americans were such a prevalent part of my life, my day-to-day interactions. One of my most bothersome stories I have as a coach is one of my good friends. I won't say his name because he was a famous NFL guy. But he recalls a time, probably it's got to be 15 years ago now. He got his first real contract, had some, good money in his pocket, and bought a really nice car, right? And he used to have to make the drive from Columbus, Ohio to Cleveland, where he was from. And you drive past some real rural, not very progressive areas, right? People don't realize that. There's some areas in Ohio a little suspect, right?
Dude, even still, I was driving to Elite FTS with my videographer in November, and I was like, look, I don't think that's a Leonard Skinner album. I'm pretty sure that's a Confederate flag on the back of that guy's truck. It's like, you're not in the South, and they lost.
Yes. So people don't realize about that part of the U.S. can be a little troublesome. Having lived in Ohio, obviously working for the Browns, I know Ohio well, and there's amazing parts of Ohio, and there's not some amazing parts. That's just a fact. And people deal with it there, it sucks. But he remembers, he was driving up from Columbus, driving north to Cleveland, and, young guy, famous to a degree already, it's not like he wasn't invisible in the world. And he just tells it matter-of-factly. He said, this white chick goes flying past him in a Mercedes, right? And he has the 22-year-old thought that I've had a million times, and that is, this is going to be awesome. She's going to catch the cops, and I can drive fast, right? He's just radar protection. And so he said he let her go, and she was probably doing like 85, 90 miles an hour in this Mercedes. So he's like, oh, this is perfect. I'll roll in about 80, 82. I'll fly home. I'll be in time to see my mom, no problem. So he said he was just cruising, and she was far enough ahead of him that, he wasn't on her ass or anything like that, nothing crazy. But, at times she would get into the left lane and he would jump into the left lane because they had to pass cars. It's like a 3-lane highway. And then he said, middle central Ohio, he said he's just driving like kind of in his own world, and boom, red and blues on his ass. And he's like, oh no, I got hit. In his mind, he said at the time, he's like, damn, they got me, not her. So he pulls over, has all his information out, and they pull him out of the car. And he's like, I don't understand. He goes, I understand I was speeding. I'm sorry. They're like, No, we have a report of a black male pursuing a white female. Someone called it in. So he explained the whole situation, said, no, that's not what happened. I'm like, I fully take fault for speeding, but I was using her as a radar trap. I'm the jerk for being young and dumb, but yeah, this is who I am. They held him without charges for 24 hours. Right? So this story is a friend of mine telling me this in 2007. We're in 2020. I have no illusions about the problems that are going on, right? And that's why I always tell people, go back and influence the people that you can influence with your voice, your eyes, your body language, your touch, your energy. Influence them to the best of your ability. Be a good person to every person that deserves you to be a good person. And if they're a good person back, that will grow. But, getting on social media and just yelling and screaming at people that have never met you before, that doesn't mean shit to me, right? It doesn't mean shit. Make a difference with the people that you can actually put your life into their life, and that's the only thing I can recommend as a coach, because it's like, I could say the perfect thing tomorrow and it could be, fakened or news bited into the worst thing you've ever heard within 3 days with social media. Right. So you got to go back to being a good person to the people that you're around. That's
the proving ground with sports. And that's what I'm really excited for. Like, I'm sure you got a handful of guys who are chomping at the bit in the off season. Like, it's a great proving ground. Like, I think of the Jesse Owens moment in the Berlin Olympics. Like, you'll never have a greater meritocracy than sport. It's like, let's line them up, let's run 100. And at the end of the day, it's merit-based. Good businesses operate this way, and great sports operate this way. It's like
good military teams do.
Yeah,
special forces
best
groups.
Man for the job.
Yeah, and when they all get together, everything's leveled out, because the person's existence is so important to the welfare of what you're trying to do, that it's like all my friends that were elite level athletes, when they get together with this other group that I now associate with, and I'm very thankful for them, of retired elite special forces people, it's amazing how gray everything is in terms of there is no separation between me and you. There's no hierarchy. There's no, to the degree where everything's fair game. Everybody's going to get a little. Everybody's going to get ribbed. Everybody's going to have their balls busted. But I'll tell you what, don't interfere with that group, because they'll fucking eat your face, right? Because there's no race, there's no religion, there's no sexuality with this group. They're just fucking people that are all on the same page.
And I think it comes with a task too, right? Like, that's what I love about sport. There's a communal task that gives people purpose and meaning. And it's like what you're seeing in this reiteration of a perfect storm after like welling people into their houses for, 3 months at a time, taking their job. It's, the worst thing you could do. Like, I had a neighbor, he lived down my street, old dude. He's Polish. His family would come visit him, stay in a one of those big tour bussy things out front of his house for like a couple weeks in the summer. Didn't speak much English, and he had a dog. It was a golden retriever, and he walked this thing like that was his purpose in life. It was to walk this golden retriever, and like he walked more than anyone I ever met. Like, it seemed like he woke up in the morning, and it was his job to shepherd this animal. And you could see it, rain, shine, sleet, snow, and it would be snowing sideways. And this old Polish dude would just be walking around the neighborhood, go up around the high school, come back, do a couple laps of the track, and his dog died. Guy was dead within a month.
A month?
Within the month, he was dead.
He had no purpose.
No purpose. And that's the thing. And it's like, some people aren't in a situation right now where I think they had a purpose. And even if it was something, like, I come across, so like some of the most incredible people I have met are people that on the surface have jobs that don't necessarily have a meaning, but they assign a meaning to it and they do it so well that you're like, holy fuck, like there's an artful way to serve coffee. There's like, you know, it's not just a job, it's a purpose. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing, and like to glean and like to pull from sports. And what I think really unifies, like, to me, one of the best racial movies of all time. Everyone's like, oh, you got to watch this, you got to watch this. Like, watch Remember the Titans. Watch Remember the Titans. Watch Coach Boone. Watch that movie, know it backwards. And I think that, to me, and again, it uses sports. Like, I mean, we're very similar in the sense that we use training analogies to think deeper, because we've thought so deep about training as like, oh, we can apply concepts laterally. And like, I look at that, and I think hopefully that the resurgence of sport will teach people like the resurgence of purpose. Like, I mean, I got guys chomping at the bit. Looks like I just got off the phone this morning. Like, the Panthers will be back in session. Sorry, guys, 23rd to the 28th. We're going to get back into camp. And then some people's purpose is to follow the Panthers. And they'll have that again. And it's like, look, if it doesn't serve anyone else, but it serves you and your family and the people directly around you, fantastic. But I think that's what a lot of people, like, you know, we had marches here in Sydney, but I had, like, and I'm all for freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and against, you know, any sort of tyrannical overuse of force and all that. I'm as neutral a stance as you can take on the protests and all that. Like, I'm far from neutral, actually more encouraging, but I had things to do, and not that like my things were more important, but to the people I was directly talking to on that day, like, I had a purpose, I had a task. Like, I think if everyone, and again, that was for me what, like, my parents used. Did you go to church as a kid?
I did, off and on.
Yeah, same. Right. Until I had hockey on Sunday morning, God was kind of it. Right. He's like, you know, he's totally watching. Yeah. You better look out.
Exactly.
You don't smoke the drugs. And it's just like, once it was like, all right, the kid's like, he wants to play all right at sports. He's probably not going to blow it up his nose. Your mother's a tooth fairy. We do Christmas and we do it up in the middle of the night. It's like, oh, okay. All right. Gotcha. Thanks. Appreciate it. But yeah, and it's just whatever it is, I think people on the other end of this, like, hopefully they can find, like, again, that the awareness of self that you talk about. And then from that purpose, like, find something, like, geez, pick up a rock and carry it up the hill. At least you're worth doing that, you know?
100%. It's like one of my good buddies, not only is he a cop, but he's also African-American in Boston. Right. So as soon as everything went off, I called him up and I'm like, how you doing? First of all, right? Like, I don't give a shit about anything else. How are you doing? And then I'm like, okay, break it down for me. What'd you guys do last night? And he goes, oh man, he explained all the different levels of what he was seeing. And at the end of it, he goes, you know what? A lot of it is, he goes, it's starting at home. He goes, you know, people don't realize it. We're seeing a lot of 14, 15-year-old kids at 4 a.m. He goes, that doesn't make sense. He goes, that's a problem. He goes, the other problem that we have is, he referred, you know, he just called them youngins, right? But he's like, these youngins are just looking for a quick step to the top. And that's how he described it. They're looking at, like, how do I get famous? How do I get more money? How do I get more stuff? How do I impress my friends? How do I show up with all this stuff that I may have got my hands on? How do I do any of these things that give me clout? And we talked about it for a minute, and I'm like, man, if only I could get a hold of some of those guys and redirect that energy, because they got energy. It's just misdirected, you know?
Well, that was your Summer Strong talk, right? I look at that and it's like, you can't, and this is something I've been talking a lot, because now, you know, the open forum for discussion in what we do, and like, you know, I can't go into gyms and talk. I can't go into schools and lecture. So there's like all of a sudden an eerie, like, unified platform again, where people are trying to skip the queue. Like, I loved the beginning of that talk, and I refer back to that one because, like, that's probably my favorite that I've come across in your presentations. But it's like, you talk about this idea that, look, like, you were doing this behind, like, the white belt mentality with no, like, you did it when there was no option to be videotaped and liked and subscribed and double tapped and shared and reposted and all this nonsense.
Yeah. Like, so strong before you could, what was the old saying? It's like, I was strong before the internet.
Yeah.
Right. It's a
you hang
different
your hat
time.
on that.
Yeah.
You put that on your CV and your resume. Cause it's, I mean, a lot of, but you're seeing it, man. Like, a lot of people, like, they don't, and I was guilty of this for a long time. Like, that was my identity. That was my outer valence of intersectionalities. That's what I was propped up on, was being like, I was the big guy, right? I was the guy that, like, oh, you know, like, don't cross him, or like, oh no, that's his girl. Like, it's like, But dude, the year before I met you, a year to the day, I had a panic attack that landed me in Stanford University Hospital.
Panic attacks suck, dude. They fucking suck.
And that was for me, like, you know, the outer valence, that wire frame that I made for myself, that collapsed. Like, so you can't only hold so much. And it was just like, here's the big guy with a 12 lead EKG and an echocardiogram, because hopefully his heart's not failing. I'm trying to carry his heavy ass around. And it was like, that's when the awareness started to kick in. And that's why one of the reasons I decided to, you know, join Ben and fucking dirty, hairy Alex Vallada with like the fucking 2-foot revolver, was like, all right, man, like if I'm going to die, it's going to be on my terms.
Oh, fuck, so dude. You're talking to me in a way which I can totally relate to. So 2 parts about that. One, when I got to the house and Ben opened the door, I realized that you guys had been down an adventurous road that was quite horrific, because you guys were so fucking sunburnt. I've never seen anything like it. Like, I was like, because we haven't met yet, right? So I'm like looking at Ben, and I don't want to say anything right away, because I'm looking at him. I'm like, and Megan's with me. You know, she lives up here. She's a high alpine, you know, chick. So this is her world. Like, you know, she did 3 14ers in one day, 3 highest in North America, 2 on her 33rd birthday. So she's like, I can already sense that she sees it. And I'm like, oh, fuck, these guys got fucking torched, right? So I'm like, holy shit. So you got like 3 tomatoes sitting in the fucking house, right? And it's funny because you guys were going through something that I was actually going down that road at the same time. So there'd been a time where I was like, you know, 290 pounds, which for me was really heavy, you know, fucking RDL, like when I was with the Browns, I think I RDL'd like 585 for a dozen, like just freaky strong. What happened to me? I started working for Poliquin, traveling 200 days a year, sleeping in shit hotels, trying to be the absolute best version of myself for all the students coming through the door, just pouring myself into something, not healthy, not doing things right. Fucking panic attack. And then I became extremely sensitive to the feeling of a panic attack. So A, I'm not in very good cardiovascular shape. B, I'm stressed to the nuts. I start working for the Saudis overseas, and that's like the princess I went to work for. She is a track athlete that is a phenomenal athlete, and that's a whole nother podcast. But when Princess Sarah took me on, she, in a sense, she saved my life, because she pulled me away from that world and gave me a very simple job. I had to train one athlete and do a really good job with it, but it gave me a lot of time to refocus on self. And I realized I needed to get back into shape, and I needed to start taking care of myself. But as recently as 3.5 years ago, I would have a panic attack when I got to 11,000 feet in altitude, because the sensation would bring back all these things. And I've talked about this on a podcast before, and I've talked to Brandon Lilly about it. And finally I said to myself, because I wanted to hang out with this girl that was at home in high altitude, and I also wanted to get back into my first love, which was alpine skiing. I said to myself, it's like, fuck it. If I'm going to go, I would rather go at the top of this mountain out of breath than in a fucking subway in the UK, because that's your options. You can either keep grinding away, or you can like just try to break free of that world you're living in, that city environment, and get away from it. And a perfect example, between my podcast, and I'm by no means am I an endurance athlete, but between my podcast with Matt Vincent this morning and talking to you today, I ran for 45 minutes at 10,000 feet. It wasn't fast, but it happened. And it wasn't that big of a deal. But fuck, has it been a hard road to get that.
And that's just something that gives purpose, right? Like that's a victory just because you're not having a panic attack. The second you start running, like that's a win. Like, dude, I remember getting to Mammoth. I don't
keep Xanax in an emergency pill case when I travel anymore. Like that's one Xanax for the whole, God, what if I have a panic attack and people judge me? Fuck.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. It's a weird, I mean, I think it's coming less. I think it's, again, social media for better or for worse. I think the medium is going to be the message. Like it's stuff I only talk about when I can talk about it. It's not like Mental Health Tuesday Instagram post. Like, this is not a medium for dialogue, guys. This is a medium for me shouting at you and how to train maybe a little bit better. And if it's really complex, I'll get on the podcast. That's why I have one, because we could spend 2 hours sitting there and riffing and going into the nuance and details, because it's exactly what the topic is worth, right? And I
100%.
And it's like you said before, it's like, you know, do what you can to the people around you. And everything you listed off was sensory. It was tactile. It was verbal. It was smell, touch, taste. It was everything interaction. It's like, even with this, we can only do so much. Like, understanding the limitations of the mediums of social media and being able to, like, really good, and this is like a bit lateral, but like really good content creators and people who take that seriously know that a YouTube audience is different than an Instagram audience. So they curate, right? And again, like, getting back to the core essence of self and like the valences that we build up in the outer borders of our intersectionality and the ideologies that inhabit these intersectionalities. It's like, if you can tear those down and have that essence be able to spring out, like, I'm going to go train with a dude in West Sydney in a few hours. He's, you know, he's a big jack dude. And it's like, I'm going to go in, I'm going to wear the all red Nike, like the Nike AF ones that my girlfriend bought me for Christmas. I'm going to be about 1.5 inches taller, because they're basically platform shoes. I got the Gasp triple XL on, because, like, you know, I'm of kin. It's not, you know, it's not like I'm going out and like buying Gucci or anything, but this is a spiraling off of me, and I know who's at the essence of this. And if he starts firing off at the mouth about something I disagree with, all of my core essence, I'll be like, yeah, hey man, like, fuck you, like, that's, I don't believe in that. But it's verbal, it's a dialogue, it's a conversation, and I think that's where a lot of, like, you know, and it's not curated, right? Like, we don't have a speech. We didn't know we were doing a podcast till 20 minutes into this, and I like that's why I like the podcast, and that's what I love about. And dude, I'm gonna have to get you on the podcast again, because your thought process around training, as in depth as your thought process, is like, how you do one thing is how you do everything. Right? So if you're sitting there and explaining, like, you know, how you're structuring your interval training. Like, I fucking hate the assault bike, but dude, the second you're on the assault bike, it's my favorite story it's the best thing on TV. Is your Instagram stories when you're training. It's the best. It's my favorite thing to watch, because it's just like, you talk in a way where it's like, like and even now in social issues, like, there's a methodology to it. Right. And I think the great proving ground is, like, you want to acid test an idea. You can write an article, sure. You can have someone critique a book, or, you know, peer review a research paper. That's fine. But, you know, how oh, I forgot to put a comma there. It's like, no. Listen to Woodske put a dramatic pause into the middle of the jewel thief story. Like, that's the ultimate proving ground, is like getting up and that immediate feedback of, like, oh shit, like, I probably shouldn't have said that joke. Oh, I'm going to, like, change this a little bit. Because not only when you teach, are you teaching, you're teaching people how to unlearn their biases while learning their biases that you need to unteach before you can actually teach them. And, like, I think that to me is, like, the better communicators that we become. And that's not writing better captions and learning how to do the thing where you're like, I've learned how to do it, but, like, putting the perfect space in the Instagram so it creates a paragraph like dissertation in your Instagram caption. Like, that's not good communication, man. Like, and again, I think when it comes to, obviously, like, the more technical side of training and stuff, I'd love to have you back on, because I think you're it as far as programming human performance for. Oh no, dude, like, it's just, you'll be like out of breath on the assault bike, like an old fucking Ottawa Senators player after a game, trying to get the lactic flush out, and explaining like how you're going through like A class, B class, C class exercises in your session, and it's just like, holy fuck. But again, and
this is the inevitable bedroom workouts too. Like, this is like trying to make the best of a weird situation.
Yeah, I remember your kitted out place in Saudi, and like your workouts there. You got the trap
that's
bar.
her house. Those are all her weight rooms she designed. This woman is very unique. You know, for someone who was the daughter of the former crown prince, she designed all those weight rooms. Like, gosh, I wish the world was different. And I wish that she wasn't under such threat by a million different people, because she's fascinating. How could someone in that world know so much about our world?
We're going to have to do a volume 2.0, because we didn't even get into the Zach Brown stuff.
Which I know, that's a whole nother world.
You totally forgot about that, man.
Yeah,
you're like,
traveling with a rock band is crazy. I met Triple H. One of the best conversations I've ever had in my life was with Triple H, and he instigated it.
You're a strength coach, Woodske, from fucking nowhere, British Columbia. But dude, like that's it though. That's it. I think I think passion is a currency that you can trade in. That's a language that's universal, and it's like you speak that so fluently about strength training that I think you can make people care about strength training that don't care about strength training, just because you care so much. Like I have friends that are into like bow hunting. Like my friend Shane is into bow hunting. He crafts like amazing custom recurve and longbows, and like sitting in the garage with the thing of Osage and like putting in it and like putting the antler tip at the end. I was like, but dude, the way he talks about it, I'm like, make me a fucking bow, make me a bow, and send me photos. That's amazing, right? So this idea that you've been able to use that passion, you throw a hammer to get you into Coeur d'Alene, actually throw the hammer as far as you told them you could, get into Coeur d'Alene, and then use that to, again, the Poliquin group. Like for me, Charles was a large reason why I do what I do. I read an article when I was 15. I was like, I don't know what this is, but that's what I want to do. And then how you transition to the Middle East story, which I still don't think we've given due diligence on explaining. And then, on tour, like backstage, Jake, you sent me just an Instagram message, like a DM once. It was a video, and it was you in studio with Zach Brown, and he was just sitting in the background playing a riff, and you're just
dude, I'm on that album.
That's so sick.
So here's how fucking crazy. I'll tell you a quick story. So Zach was recording the new album, a few months ago. I was there to help him out with his strength training stuff, and then, just be around because he's such an easy guy to hang out with. And I had like an armful of shit. I had to like bring in a bunch of stuff. I was helping somebody, and I stepped through the door of Southern Ground Studio, and I can see that it's a buzz already. Like this guy has crazy work ethic, and he's just like wide-eyed and happy-go-lucky, right? And he's like, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I'm like, and it's like he was coming out of the control room down the stairs into the studio. He's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I got this stuff you told me to grab for you from the bus." He's like, "Come on in." So I'm like, "Oh shit." So, I'm used to him now. So I just followed him in, and there's like 5 guys in the audio recording booth, and they're recording boys in the band. And I'm like, he goes, "Come on in." And he's laughing. And he's just having a good time. So I'm standing there holding like some packages, talking to Jason, who is like the bass guitar and one of the other guitar techs. He's in there. He's laughing because he works with all sorts of people. He's worked with AC/DC, everybody. And so I'm like, "What are we doing?" He's like, "I think we're singing on the album." And I'm like, "I can't sing." He's like, "Don't worry." He goes, "It's going to kind of be like a chant. You'll be fine." So Zach pulls out a piece of paper, and he's like, "Okay, when I say," and the music starts to play, and he goes, "When I give my hand, all you guys chant, 'That's who we are.'" So I'm like, "Fuck it." Right. So, and he's like, 1, 2, 3, boom. We hit it. We do a bunch of different lines, and fucking now forever, I'll be one of these voices chanting on the album.
And if you guys, for me, Zach Brown is, I made a vow like probably 5 or 6 years ago that I'd never see another concert. I went to a concert. It was a really bad experience. Like, you know what? I'm done. I don't like crowds. I like being in bed by 8:30. And then Zach Brown came to SAP Center. I tapped my student loan that month to get ground seats. Like my hands were at the stage. I was at his feet. And it was when they did the Dave Grohl EP.
Right.
And fucking hand to God, man. I'm at SAP Center, downtown San Jose, Saturday night, comes out and they just crush it. Like as good as their albums are, their covers are even better. And then just very nonchalantly, Zach goes, "All right, this is the coolest thing we've ever done to play times like these alongside the Zach Brown Band, ladies and gentlemen, Dave Grohl." And they started collabing on. So Dave Grohl comes out, and like I grew up, man, with hair down to my shoulders, a Zach Wilde Les Paul in my hand. I just sat there before I found a barbell and just went riff after riff after riff. And I just sat there, and I think I started spinning in circles. I think I physically just started like looking up at the ceiling
man.
and like speaking in tongues, but also singing the song at the same time. And it's like the coolest, like for me, just from a musicianship standpoint, like, it's the front and center with the slap bass or like the standing bass doing a solo. It's like, So the fact that you took from the Middle East to the tour bus to the recording studio. Like you took a barbell further than anyone ever.
Right? Like
so
people
crazy.
Like, it's like, how did you end up traveling and living on Zach Brown's bus? And I'm like, because I got him to ride an assault bike. Like, I mean, that's it. Like, you know, he's a normal, simple dude, and he likes to work out, which, by the way, without any real exercise, and this for like the meatheads in us. So he decided last year, before I ever met him, to lose a bunch of weight on a ketogenic diet. So the first day I ever meet him, you know, kind of in the weight room outside of like normal clothes, we're at his house in his basement, and he's standing there in a pair of shorts, and he's got giant fucking veins going down these gigantic quads. And then I'm like, what the fuck? I'm like, 22-inch calves. And I'm like, what's the deal with your legs, dude? And he's like, I don't know. They've always been this way. And I'm like, you could have done other stuff. Like, music is your gift, but you probably could have wrestled. You're like phenomenally built to be a wrestler. He's like, yeah, I played football in high school. But, you know, just to jump back on that Dave Grohl thing, in the studio at Southern Ground, in the wall framed, is the handwritten lyrics on paper that Dave wrote while he was there, framed. Like, it's just there, you know? And it's like, that stuff to me, it's like, I can be around famous people. I can be around the billionaires of the world. I've eaten dinner with kings and queens. It never gets less interesting. But at the same time, totally content to hang out with somebody that is more like me than anything else, right? Right.
You're more content to hop on a podcast at 4 p.m. with me.
Yeah.
That's, dude. I mean,
because that's the thing. It's like, what I love, you know?
And how much of that stems from, this is a conversation that I have all the time. How much of that stems from like understanding how far away you are from where you started? Like,
all the time.
And like, I grew up in Windsor, and that Windsor is the butt of all jokes. Like, Stephen Colbert had called Windsor the rectum of the universe on national television. It's like, this is the place I call home. And it's like, like, I don't look up and see mountains. I don't look out and see ocean. I look up and see smoke from the Ford factory, because my friends' dads are putting 3 doors on a fucking F-150. And that's how the city works.
A friend of mine still makes minivans.
Right. And it's just like, I'm grateful for them. I'm grateful that's where I came from. Because right now I get to look out and I'm staring at Bondi Beach in the Pacific Ocean. Right. And it's like, we've been here for 3 months. It's the longest I've been in one place. And you can attest to this more than anyone else. This is the longest I've been in the same place for in 2.5 years.
It's a weird feeling.
You could but like every day I look out and I wake up early just so I can see like the sunrise over the ocean. And if people live here, like, I'm out and I'm the only one outside. My girlfriend will come with me because she shares a similar appreciation for like the little things. Everyone that lives in this condo building that I'm renting from this other dude, they don't care.
They don't care.
Because it's like, they grew up with it. It's like, oh man, are you serious? Like, I grew up and I saw like the Sal and Dom Rossetti across the street. Like, that was the Italian family. And then Nonna lived next door. And somehow like 4 other Nonnas lived on the same block. And then it was like, that was my view. So it's like, you know, when I get a chance to, like, someone will message me on Instagram and like, oh, hey, like my knee here. It's like, oh, and try doing this. Like, I can't believe you answered. It's like, I can't believe you asked. Right. Like, why would you? That's so cool to me. And like, I think that's something like, you know, and I watch you navigate like these crazy situations and I'm like, his mind must be fucking blown.
It's crazy. Like, I grew up in the bottom of a valley in British Columbia that got barely any sunlight. We had, you know, more wolves than we had people at different times of the year. You know, this sound politically correct to some people, and it's just reality. You know, I once hid inside with my brother the carcass of a dead elk so that we could spot other animals that were trying to come and get the dead elk, right? That's where we came from.
It was like a tauntaun? What are you doing?
Yeah, so these wolves took down this elk and hollowed it out. We found it on it was like the frozen Columbia River. So it's, you know, minus 35. Me and my brother are teenagers, come across an elk that's hollowed out, wolf hair everywhere, which, by the way, I've French kissed a wolf in real life and actually had one put its teeth against the back of my head, which is totally weird. Yeah, it's
story for another time.
Another time. But that's how we started, like, where it was so quiet and empty that you know, like they always say, if you can get to a place in the universe where it's quiet enough, you'll be amazed at how loud the universe actually is. It actually makes noise. And that's the town I grew up in. You can hear the earth. That's how isolated we were. So, I used to do a presentation called A Road Anywhere, because my town had one road that went north and south, one paved road, and it was Highway 95. And so a road anywhere was basically better than staying there. And it didn't matter where it went because my choices were so limited. But it's like, if you go back and look at the start of a presentation I did for Sornex, I think it was either Sornex 10, and the start of the presentation is the difference between ordinary and extraordinary. And I give a story about a trip to Finland. That's how I look at life. Like, there's I can tell you the same story twice, and all I have to do is put the energy of life into it. And that's the difference between an ordinary and extraordinary existence. So like I always say, I could tell you, one time I went to Finland for work, and I was standing at night looking into a forest. It was pretty cool, right? Or I could tell you how it really happened. And I could say, one time I went to Finland to visit a girl that I was dating who was a former Miss Finland. We were out on her farm in Viti, Finland, and the aurora borealis was so bright that it woke me up from my sleep. So I went out onto the grass and I wandered towards the forest, and I looked into the darkness of a forest, and 1,000 eyes of the Finnish wilderness looked back at me. And as I stood there staring into the darkness and the eyes of the forest stared back at me, I heard the faint sound of a woman's voice that called out "Kulta, kulta," which in Finnish means honey or gold. And after a number of times, I turned and looked, and I saw a Finnish woman standing on a porch holding a lantern and a knife, asking me, "Why are you standing naked out on the grass?" And I responded innocently, "I don't know. It seemed like there's nothing better to do," And that's the difference between ordinary, extraordinary story. It's the same story, but one is with all the details in between, and that's life. Life is the details in between all the big happenings,
Yeah, and I think that speaks to, hopefully we can get you on again and talk about the training, but if there's any greater proof of concept of like the importance of nuance, and as for our conversation today, like nuance and conversation and the details, right. It's like, that's where all the fun stuff is. That's where the story lies, man. I really appreciate you taking the time, dude. Honestly, I don't want to take up any more of your time. This has ran for longer than we had expected, but I could sit here literally all day. Next time we're doing this in person,
that'd be sweet.
Once the world opens up, we'll go to Area 52 or Death Valley or whatever.
Yeah, man.
And
we'll sit on the Alabama hills and watch UFOs.
We're just going to smash 5 grams of shrooms and just record this, whether or not it ever makes it onto iTunes or Spotify. Honestly, man, thank you so much for taking the time. I've been looking forward to this since we kind of conceived this idea. I really appreciate everything you do, everything you put out. I'll put everything on the front of it, where to find you and all that, so you don't have to go through so where do people find you on Instagram there, Dave? Well, it's at this. I'll take care of all that. Yeah. I'll give a little bit of a backstory, man. Appreciate your time. Hopefully we can do this again soon. Thanks so much.
Man, I can't thank you enough.
No, it's been my pleasure, man, honestly.